I am personally not very familiar with tears. I have heard from human beings that they are basically watery and incredibly salty, and they are usually accompanied by disgusting mucus. However, myself being a cyborg from the future, I have clearly no idea of how that goes about. My tear glands have been deactivated for quite a few years now, but something recently happened that completely blew me away and somehow overrode my programming, and I definitely felt the emotion that human beings refer to as sadness. And this all came at the heels of knowing that one of the most iconic voice actors of the last few generations, Kevin Conroy, passed away this past week, and it really hit incredibly hard for those of us that are big DC fans. Those of us that have been following the Batman lore, the DC universe for years now, and primarily focused in on the animated series, although in the last few years he had been crossing over to other projects such as He-Man, and then eventually he was attached to a lot of the bigger video games. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing today. We're going to try to commemorate all of his amazing work throughout the years. I'm going to try to somehow narrow it down to the top 5, but obviously that is a near impossible feat. Let me know in the comments section what your favorite Kevin Conroy not only project is, but also what maybe your favorite memory is of his. I think he's definitely crossed over and touched not only fans of movies, but also video games, and even those of us that are hardcore comic book fans. So like I said, go ahead and voice your opinion in the comments section. And let's start off with number 5. Before all of you guys get your bat nips in a twist, it was really difficult to choose between all the video games that he's been a part of, obviously. And I think we could probably make an entire video or an entire top 5 just dedicated to, his video game voice acting appearances. But number 5 has to go to Arkham Knight, which was the final entry into the Rocksteady Batman universe. The game was beautiful, creative, and immersive, and it really brought Gotham to life in a 3D format. You were able to use all the vehicles and the gadgets to drive around and glide around the entire map. It was incredibly gritty and down to earth and realistic, and it was completely hailed by all of the critics. The video game was absolutely superb in almost every single category, and the attention to everything involved with the entire franchise was absolutely breathtaking. They even had Jeff Johns working on the story, who is probably one of the better DC comic book writers out there. Mark Hamill obviously reprised his role as Joker. He was absolutely breathtaking. And then obviously Kevin Conroy voicing the Batman for the Arkham Rocksteady universe, where he gave us some of the more memorable quotes. Anything from saying simple lines like Alfred all the way to his marquee interrogation scenes. It was absolutely vintage work from Kevin Conroy. And he was still as iconic as ever, even though at that point when the Arkham Knight video game came out, if my math is correctly, he had been doing the Batman voice for well over 20 years, and he was supposed to be basically voicing a 30-something-year-old, mid-30-something-year-old Bruce Wayne, and yet he was still absolutely brilliant at it. As I mentioned, I had to throw at least one video game into the top 5 list for all those gamers out there. Now let's move on to number 4, and we're going to be talking about the first animated Batman movie ever to be released in theaters, and that is Batman Mask of the Phantasm. Definitely a personal favorite of mine growing up. I remember watching it on VHS. I know most kids will be scratching their heads wondering what a VHS is. I know it sounds like some weird sexually transmitted disease, but it's not. I guarantee you it's the way that us old folks used to watch movies back in the day. Not only is this considered probably the best animated Batman movie of all time, but this is also the first time that Kevin Conroy got a mic shoved in his face and told to voice Batman, and he did an absolutely stellar job, and he worked alongside of mainstays like Dana Delaney. And for those of us that are big giant fans of the animated DC franchise, will be very familiar with her. She did obviously play Andrea, but then she would also eventually become a pretty big voice in the industry, at least in the animated DC side of things. She also eventually went on to voice Lois Lane in the Justice League Flashpoint Paradox animated film. The pairing obviously had an insane amount of chemistry, and they did a fantastic job for the film, even though it wasn't considered a commercially successful film because of the low revenue stream that they were able to garnish at the box office. But that hasn't stopped rabid DC fans from building a small little cult following behind this film. As I mentioned before, the community basically considers this to be the best animated DC film of all time, and it's not difficult to see why. It was definitely gritty, it was very dark, and I think it played off of a lot of what the morals and principles that Batman has basically made his mantra now for decades. Next up, for number 3, we actually have the first animated series of the list. The top 3 might actually make some people rip their hairs out because all 3 of them are interchangeable. They're all great television series, and it's basically the equivalent of choosing your favorite child or the equivalent of choosing your favorite Mountain Dew. Basically the same, although we all know it's Code Red. We are talking Justice League, the 2001 series, which featured some of the heaviest hitters in the industry. We had voice actors like Kevin Conroy, Phil Lamar, who was Green Lantern but is more well known for his roles in Futurama, for example. And to my surprise, he is actually Marvin from Pulp Fiction, which I found out while doing a quick little search online. He's one of the unlucky characters that actually gets to witness Samuel L. Jackson preaching all while eating a big giant kahuna burger. You also have Susan Eisenberg, who is actually a pretty big voice actress, not only in the DC animated universe, but also in the video game industry, having been involved with projects such as Destiny 2 and Mass Effect as well. Kevin Conroy was again superb, but I think it had more to do with the chemistry within all of the voice actors involved. Their voices really became synonymous with their characters, and they just happened to riff off each other perfectly. For those of us growing up in that exact time frame, it was an absolute breath of fresh air. We had been reading Justice League comic books growing up as kids, and to finally see an animated series based on the adventures of the Justice League was absolutely amazing. And this is probably the closest thing that he ever got to doing a supporting cast role for an animated DC show or a film, just because if you go and look at the credits, he was actually not in every single episode. Even though Batman is a central character of the Justice League, there were a few characters where he was omitted or he wasn't present in. So I think it was really a breath of fresh air to actually see him not be in a central role in the voice acting side of things. He was more of, like I said, a supporting character or a supporting member, if that makes any sense, and he was still able to flourish and do a great job, even though the entire show didn't necessarily revolve around him. For number 2, we actually have the new Batman Adventures animated series. It surprisingly only ran for 24 episodes from 1997 to around 1999. And obviously Kevin Conroy voiced Batman, but we also got introduced to one of the bigger voice actors known to the community, with Tara Strong, who has voiced a number of different characters within the DC universe, not just in the animated department, but also in video games. She was obviously Harley Quinn in the Arkham series. She was a part of the crew for the Powerpuff Girls as well. She also voiced Barbara Gordon, not only in this particular animated series, but also in the Killing Joke animated film. So it was an absolute stellar cast. On top of that, you actually got to see Batman or Bruce Wayne kind of evolve as a character in this particular show. Most episodes didn't necessarily just centralized on Bruce Wayne and Batman. You got to see a little bit of his sidekicks, anywhere from like Barbara Gordon obviously to Robin. We even got introduced to Dick as well. And in case you guys were wondering, yes, Mark Hamill actually was the Joker in this particular animated series as well. The animated series was basically supposed to be somewhat of a sequel to the Batman animated series, which had aired a few years earlier in 1992. And even though it didn't garner as much praise as the original series, it still garnered quite a bit of a following, and critics still overall had a pretty positive consensus towards it. And it has become an absolute staple to what we now know as the Conroy legacy. Before we get to our number 1 spot, I actually wanted to do something a little bit different, talk about some honorable mentions, different projects that didn't quite make the top 5 list, but were still absolutely brilliant performances from Kevin Conroy. The first honorable mention obviously has to go to the Injustice video game line. So far, only 2 have been included in the franchise, but there seems to be a possibility of more coming very soon, which is obviously painful to think that we could potentially get a Injustice video game sequel without Kevin Conroy directly involved. But all in all, it's an absolute breath of fresh air to see old school voice actors such as Kevin Conroy who are willing to embrace the different changes in the industry, and they were willing to adapt from old school animated series all the way down to modern day video games. And finally, the last spot obviously has to go to the remainder of the Arkham series here. We mentioned the Arkham Knight as probably the most iconic one, only because it was the most critically well received video game, but the entire line of video games that has come from Rocksteady has been absolutely phenomenal, and Kevin Conroy was an absolute mastermind along with Mark Hamill and that entire star-studded cast. Finally, for our number 1 spot, we have Batman the Animated Series, which ran from 1992 to 1995 and had a grand total of 85 episodes until it was eventually canceled. And yes, again, we had both Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy reprising their roles, or I guess introducing themselves into the role of Joker and the Batman respectively. This would be basically the beginning of just an amazing partnership from these two brilliant voice actors. We were also introduced to Arlene Sorkin, who not only voiced Harley Quinn in this particular series, but actually reprised her voice acting skills in the Arkham Asylum video game, and an insane, staggering amount of other projects, other video game projects, as well as other animated series and films as well. The show was incredibly dark and gritty, and just a very good representation of what most of us thought Gotham would be like in an animated format. And Kevin Conroy perfectly played into what the Batman was and what he represented at the time. The repertoire and the chemistry that both Mark Hamill and Kevin Conroy developed, I think, really started with this particular animated series, and it blossomed into something stellar. The series actually went on to win a Primetime Emmy, as well as a plethora of other smaller awards. So that is our list, people of the YouTubes. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think. What is the all-time greatest project that Kevin Conroy was ever a part of? Let me know. I'm very interested, very intrigued to see what your responses are. I will try to respond to as many of them as I possibly can. So let me know in the comment section. And as always, every list is subjective, but it's always fun putting them together. Thank you guys for tuning in. I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you.